was asked, "Didn't God tell Noah that every moving thing was food?" This is true. In the book of Genesis, also known as the book of beginnings, there's a passage where God speaks to Noah and his sons after the great flood has subsided, and God is quoted as saying, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." This verse has been often framed or highlighted by Christians in response to the idea of veganism, in an attempt to disqualify veganism from Christian consideration, or at least one's own consideration as a Christian. I'll attempt to explain why, in my understanding, the verse in Genesis 9 that describes animals as food can be applicable to the topic of veganism, but why this verse in no way excuses using animals as food arbitrarily. Here's how I see this verse as applicable. The verse is found in Genesis chapter 9, which is still closely linked to the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1. And it's appropriate to qualify each verse with the other, especially seeing the literary similarity. In chapter 1, God's creation and process is revealed, and in this narrative, just like the chapter 9 verse that says, "shall be food for you," in reference to every living thing, God similarly says, "shall have them for food." However, in chapter 1, this is said in reference to plant foods only. In chapter 1, God says, "I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food." One can recognize the literary or phrasal similarity between the verse in chapter 9 and the verse in chapter 1, as well as the close proximity in the biblical narrative that links them. It is noteworthy that God said plants shall be food for you before he said that every moving thing shall be food for you. And it's worth noting that here only, where plants are food, does the narrative describe the situation as good. The latter is not defined as either good nor bad in the biblical narrative. If one follows the biblical narrative from the beginning of the book of Genesis, we can see that the food prescribed first, plant-only food, came before the fall, or before Adam and Eve separated themselves from God. This pre-fall era or environment is thought of as heavenly, good, or an environment free from evils and violence. After the fall, humankind and creation entered into an era where the world or creation was not as it should be, and this is the context in which animals are called food. So we can see, first of all, that according to the narrative, the original design was free from violence, free from using animals as food, though eventually the narrative includes moving creatures as food. This is only after the world is not as it should be, and it is never called good. The verse where animals are called food also doesn't say that we should or must eat animals, only that we shall eat animals. I would suggest that this is an accommodation, not a commandment, an accommodation for a fallen or less than perfect world where plant foods are not always readily available. Consider the context of the passage where animals are called food. There has just been a great flood. The land has not yet been cultivated. Fruit trees have not yet had a chance to grow, be pollinated, to produce fruit. Tubers and grasses are not yet ready to yield food. The preeminent need for this small group of humans would be survival. God could be giving Noah and his sons a permission, an accommodation to do what they were unsure of, morally speaking, to take the life of an animal in order to survive. Noah, freshly aware that violence had real and severe consequences, might have been unsure of what was permissible in this new beginning for him and his family. It is my opinion that because of where this verse comes in the biblical narrative, God is permitting animals as food simply as an accommodation, as a permission in certain situations. But I am also of the opinion that this passage in no way reveals a God who excuses arbitrary animal exploitation or who cares little of the suffering of animals. The definition of veganism according to the Vegan Society is that one should avoid the use of animals wherever possible. Therefore, it is not necessary for a vegan to avoid animal foods in a survival situation or where alternatives don't exist. It's about doing what is practicable and possible, and not about being perfect. In certain situations, a vegan may have little choice but to put their own needs of survival above the needs of an animal. Like an indigenous person deep in the Amazon, far from a supermarket, catching a fish to feed their family, Noah and his sons, his family, like many humans throughout history, have found themselves in survival situations, and therefore the use of animals would not be outside of God's permission according to the verse, or outside of the proper definition of veganism. However, humans in my experience have also often been in situations where we've had the choice to avoid causing animal suffering and have chosen incorrectly, often using tradition, perhaps originally born out of necessity, but then continued out of habit, taste, or convenience. Genesis 1:29 reveals God's original design, and is for humans to eat plant foods. One would be on shaky ground to use Genesis chapter 9, verse 3 to excuse arbitrarily taking animal life or causing unnecessary animal suffering. Genesis chapter 9, verse 3 in no way excuses killing an animal because one likes the taste, or because one enjoys hunting, or because it's traditional, or because it's more convenient, or any other arbitrary reason. In my own journey, as I stopped taking animal suffering and exploitation lightly, I slowly found that I could eliminate most every animal-derived product from my life quite easily. Unlike Noah and his sons, and perhaps many remote peoples throughout history, I found that most animal exploitation was completely unnecessary and therefore selfish. It's up to each person to carefully discern what animal use is necessary for them in their own situation, and to consider animal use inevitably causes suffering, and it goes against God's original design. Genesis 9:3 tells us it's not a sin or immoral to use animals in and of itself, but I would argue in light of Genesis 1:29, animals should only be used as food when necessary, and with the realization that it's not the way God intended it to be.